Hi and welcome to TMJ News. Today we have a guest whose military analysis videos have gotten quite popular. Greg Stoker is an anti-war activist who served 4 combat tours in Afghanistan and was in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is a unit in the U.S. Special Operations community. He now occupies a military and foreign policy niche in the wider pro-Palestine conversation, and today we're going to dig deep into his expertise to better understand what's happening on the ground. Greg, thank you again for being my guest today. One of the first things that I actually noticed when I came across your page, and that's how I'm going to start this conversation, is it's not every day that you kind of see a military guy say, I'm also anti-imperialist. Because if you consider it, you guys are kind of on the front lines of imperialism itself, you could argue, just furthering US imperialism. So the first question that immediately came to my mind is, how does that work out? Or how did it work out?
Okay. Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me on. But imperialism, yeah, you said it, the forefront, the physical manifestation of imperialism and colonialism and all that, especially for the past 20 years. I was probably at the spear tip of that because I was in a special operations community. So that was kind of why I have the view from behind the curtain about how the proverbial sausage is made. I think I started, it's been like a 10-year journey, probably more like a 13-year journey. It began with me transitioning into a more intelligence capacity where I had to learn like regional history. And since I was operating in Afghanistan, that meant learning about the Indian-Pakistan partition and the involvement of the British Raj and all the problems that caused. And then I got out of the military after about 5 years. I thought I was going to do a career, but I had a lot of issues with what was going on at that time. I didn't think Afghanistan was being run in a way that was intended to be won or to actually ever have it be secure.
Right.
I also think that Obama's drone strike policies were criminal. We were dropping, and when I say we, it was the military generally tries to follow the law of war. But it was mostly like the CIA, just like dropping whoever. Like maybe they were bad, maybe they weren't.
Right.
Like we didn't.
So you would say it was kind of indiscriminate. It wasn't really specifically targeted.
Oh yeah, like if you're on the wrong person's contact list, you're gonna get the business, and that because they're just lazy, and they would be able to just send up to the superiors like, yes, we took out this target. It was about quotas too, so just casualty manufacturing, and it was not something I wanted to be a part of.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the war in Afghanistan, and I'll talk about that before I get into Israel-Palestine issue. Mm-hmm. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of these, things that are typically attributed to kind of the height of U.S. imperialism in the modern age.
Yeah.
Even average Americans have realized, especially the war in Afghanistan, after so many years, kind of just saying, all right, cool, so we kind of did something, but the Taliban is back now, and they're, back running Afghanistan. So how were the sentiments in the military itself? Do you think what you are saying and the sentiments you began having are common, or were you kind of a standalone? Were you kind of an outcast for thinking that way?
Well, I was in a special operations unit. There is you take a military standard test, and it's like the SAT. So it's kind of elitist in that you need to have like above average in terms of like education and worldliness, because you go to language school and you just have a lot more exposure to other people and cultures. You work directly with the people on the ground, and that's something that 99% of people who even been overseas have never really done. A lot of the military is actually democratic. Only combat arms are white dudes. Like combat arms like infantry, artillery, armor, like tanks. And those are all the most like belligerent of the people. Like most people are just trying to get like free dental and go to college. So it's actually, there's a misconception that the entire military is like super conservative. It's not.
I believe when it comes to the military itself, aside from what you say about just getting the benefits, a lot of it kind of is to them justified because they are told that this is for the greater good and for democracy and for freedom and all of that stuff. So I would say,
of course, that's part of it too. Yeah.
I would say a part of it is a lot of brainwashing going on because people who look like me are depicted in a very different way to justify a lot of what the military does overseas, compared to obviously people who look like you. So I guess that kind of makes, hey, it's justified if you do it to people who might not necessarily, they're not for freedom, they're not for democracy. I guess that just makes it easier.
I went to Columbia University, so like Edward Said, Palestinian American
Yeah,
academic, he wrote Orientalism. I mean, that's what it is. It's just Orientalizing, because
exactly.
everything starts with imperialism, a want to control resources abroad and influence abroad, and Orientalism allows you to turn another group of people into the other, and that allows people to colonize or like find justification in colonialism. So yeah.
And do you think at all that influenced after you left the military? Does that continue to influence your worldview, or would you say it's kind of something you fully left behind you?
I mean, always learning.
Yeah.
Certainly in a completely different place than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I will say some things like global trade does need to happen. I completely support Houthi action right now, by the way, before I say this. But the one reason like global piracy isn't a thing and that global trade does happen and that people get some resources that they actually need, I'm not talking about like crap electronics from China, but like stuff you actually need, is because the United States military has a 13 fleet carrier group.
Right.
And it's actually kind of important to have if the world wants to keep doing what it does. That's an aspect of it. So it's not just this black and white issue where it's like all bad, which
Yeah.
complicates things.
There's nuance for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's just
Okay.
one caveat that I do have.
And kind of switching now to the Israel-Palestine issue, which is something that you've dedicated basically all of your recent work on. What would you say in the military was the general sentiment on the Israel-Palestine issue? Was it kind of a black and white thing like you mentioned earlier, or was there also nuance there?
Not really. It was during the time that the Bush administration made the really unfortunate decision to call U.S. involvement in the Middle East and Central Asia the global war on terror. So, yeah, Hamas got and Hezbollah got shunted into that. So, and then the Palestinians by, extension. So I mean,
Exactly.
the overwhelming sentiment was like pro-Israel, no matter what.
Right. And so that kind of,
That's definitely changed. But yeah, growing up as like a white millennial in Texas, it took some time to unlearn some things.
right. And so you say the sentiments have changed. How would you say that's the case?
Well, first of all, I was lucky enough to have access to certain information that I started to understand, like Israeli propaganda. Just like talking to more senior officers saying that the IDF are inveterate liars. We don't trust them. We have to do our own research and we have to collect our own intelligence on them because they will just straight up lie to us. Also, things like, yeah, the IDF is actually trash. They're a trash conscript military, which everyone thinks they're great and the fourth most powerful in the world. They're not. Nobody actually who knows anything actually believes that. He
Right.
had access to information where they just totally got the floor wiped with them by Hezbollah in 2006 when they invaded southern Lebanon. So it started with just knowing the lies and then
Right.
not liking being lied to. If I'm being honest, it didn't start with like, oh, Palestine, like they're being treated horribly. No, it started with I don't like being lied to by our allies.
It's interesting that you say even the senior kind of officials within the military. I'm guessing, to clarify, you were saying that they themselves were saying we don't trust the IDF.
Oh yeah, of course not. No,
Yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, different to what the kind of assumption we have coming from the media, where the U.S. is kind of like 100% behind Israel no matter what, even to the point of ignoring and violating international law. And you're saying that, in fact, within the very framework of the U.S. military itself, there is an inherent distrust in Israel.
I would say it's almost institutional. So the military and politics, like the military leadership and the political leadership of this country, tend to get conflated into the same group. That's a misunderstanding. Like we do have
Okay.
crazy evangelical generals, but for the most part, senior leadership and general officers are
Right.
pretty educated. They're pretty war averse. They don't want to get drawn into an unprecedented regional conflict again in the Middle East. It never works out. It creates power vacuums after we go in and smash everything. They don't want this. They don't want this. But of course, the president directly controls the military. And they didn't listen to us. The political leadership didn't listen to us in Afghanistan. They didn't listen to us in Iraq. They didn't listen to us in Syria. Like, they're not going to listen now, because the same politicians who didn't listen to us like 20 years ago, well, they're still in power because there's no age limit. So here we are.
I think one of the main reasons why this has been the case for so long is a lot of the language and propaganda that's been used surrounding just the Middle East itself. You mentioned Orientalism, and we talked about a lot of that, but I think you've also focused very deeply on the importance of language and the weaponization of language to justify all kinds of foreign intervention, which is something that kind of has spearheaded the US in terms of its foreign policy. So how do you think that language and propaganda itself has been used for so long to justify US support for Israel and just foreign intervention in general?
Well, during the Cold War, it was communists. But since the USSR fell, and now that China's kind of has somewhat more of a free market tendencies, we needed a new word. So terrorist was very convenient. The United States definition of terrorism is structured so as to justify interventionism, because states and militaries of recognized nations cannot be terrorists. Like, even if they employ terror tactics, which should be the main definition of terrorism. So, like, dropping white phosphorus on a civilian population doesn't really have a military function. It's not really even effective. It just scares the heck out of people because it burns at 2,000 degrees centigrade. But we can't call that an act of terror. Because non-state actors, individuals, groups, organizations can be terrorists, but states cannot be terrorists. It's further complicated by the fact that persons under the definition, and I did a whole video on this, maybe I'll repost it. Persons are entities, individuals, joint stock companies, financial interests that can quote unquote own property or have vested interest in property. So if your definition says it targets these acts of terror, target U.S. persons overseas, we can call them an act of terrorism. So if you are, for instance, a resistance fighter in Palestine attacking a future British petroleum site that can own land and is considered a person under U.S. terrorism definitions, yeah, you're a terrorist for attacking a British petroleum site on your land.
That's actually very interesting. So essentially, they designed all of this for a very specific purpose. We've seen Israel get away with all kinds of terrorist acts with zero accountability, and that's a really dangerous situation to be in, especially for a country that prides itself in its democracy and peace and all of that. And the U.S. has obviously defined Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, so that kind of makes it really convenient for them to get away with all ranges of terror acts. But do you think people are waking up to this? Do you think that public opinion in the U.S. is shifting? And are they realizing these realities that you're saying? Or do you think people are just an ignorance is bliss situation where they just take in everything the media is saying and kind of just blind to the realities of what's really happening on the ground?
Or they're just hopelessly racist and they're never going to change. Yeah, I mean, you can't win them all. But we're looking for the independent voter, so to speak.
Right.
There's still going to be like a hardcore no matter what happens, there's always going to be like 30% that are like Israel chai freaking death to all terrorists. So that's always going to be a thing. But in my own personal life, like, so many people have like essentially switched sides. Who started off like October 7th, it was like the worst attack ever. It wasn't. But anyways, it's beyond the scope of this conversation.
Right.
Who are now like, what the hell is going on? Like, have they always been like this? Has Israel always been like this? It was like, yeah, dude, they've always been like this.
It's been a while.
I mean, it's the same tactics. It's just never been on this demonstrably genocidal scale before. But yeah, people are realizing they've always been this way. And they've always intended to be this way.
You said the independent voters, those are the ones we're kind of focusing on.
Yeah.
One kind of big debate is whether the Zionist ideology and influence that's inherent to the US, whether it's, AIPAC or just the strength of the Zionist lobby group, is asking the question whether that will actually change, even if you have a significant amount of voters switching sides, because essentially, whether you're voting Republican or Democrat, the foreign policy isn't really changing,
Right.
realistically.
You, when it comes to like policy decisions, they tend to be more bipartisan. The identity politics and the fake culture war really only exists on a domestic level.
Right.
Because of special interest lobbies, not just special interest lobbies like APEC, but also Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, defense contractors, energy corporations. Those are all campaign contributors, and they're all part of the same system. Israel makes everybody a lot of money, and what I mean by everybody is the top 1%, the top
Yeah.
0.1% of the 1%. We still live in a democracy. It's a flawed democracy, clearly, but there's a large growing sentiment that is basically saying, look, Democrats are going to have to start losing elections if they're pro-Israel. That's the only way it's going to happen. And maybe you don't get to threaten us with a Trump presidency. Because
Right.
guess what, DNC? You didn't give us a choice. You only have one candidate, and it's Joe Genocide. And we're not
Yeah.
going to play into that game because that's not a choice. You can't vote for someone who's complicit in genocide. You just can't do it.
What would you say is the alternative? I mean, we've never actually had a candidate come. I mean, Bernie got kind of close to it, but he's kind of like, but it's sad if he's the only option we have. But there's never been a case where a serious candidate has gone serious enough where people are like, all right, this is the one candidate we can say, at least on Israel. Because one thing, Israel is a litmus test. It's kind of like if you aren't completely pro-Israel, there's no chance you're going to make it to the presidency. I mean, that's just a reality within the US government, which is why I'm asking, do you think there is any chance that it will ever get to a point where you will have a president that will question, at least, because we don't even have that, question Israel and its motives and everything that it's doing?
I'm not the most well-versed on like domestic policy, but
Right.
I just know that whatever happens, there will be no going back to the status quo. It might not be as dramatic of a change as what we want it to be, but things will never be the same again.
I hope so. But I guess even if we're talking foreign policy, why then do you think that Zionism itself is so deeply ingrained within the very fabrics of U.S. domestic and foreign policy? And do you think that will ever change?
I don't see it really changing within, what we can consider to be the ruling elite. Like, I kind of, like, before I ran off and enlisted in the Army, I grew up in the apex of, like, academic privilege. I went to a New England boarding school. 4 of my roommates were Zionists. Even if you're not a Zionist and you don't even give a damn about Israel, you're still growing up within an elitist system,
Exactly.
and like all the contacts, all your childhood friends are Jewish. You're going to have a lot of Jewish friends, and they're going to be hardcore Zionists because that's where they go to school.
One thing you mentioned that I think was really interesting, you mentioned entryism and just the divide and conquer tactic that's being heavily used in this situation in specific to weaken the Palestinian cause. Do you think that a united global populace, if we ever get that, because the Arab Gulf nations are definitely making that very difficult to happen, but if we do have a united populace, the population itself in support of Palestine, do you think that will be the card that will make the lasting change? Or do you think if country leaders aren't the ones making these choices, nothing will ever really change?
I don't think that's true. I think history has shown that, if things get oppressive enough and if people aren't represented enough, there is a systemic governmental overhaul, usually in the form of revolutions and stuff. We're nowhere near that in America. Like, people think that's the case, but no. You're still going to Starbucks and yoga class and spin class, so you're nowhere near the mindset for an uprising. The biggest thing we can do is yes, our voting systems actually aren't compromised. It's still a democracy. The Electoral College is a joke, but you can still vote, especially in local elections. That's a big deal. Vote for everybody, like
Right.
judges, sheriffs. That's what you can do in your local sphere. But what we could do globally, and that's the thing about the BDS movement, like because that, like we do live in kind of a capitalist dystopia, and these companies are these CEOs and these board members have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, and if their stance is like Israel no matter what, and we're like we just lost $14 billion, you need to stop talking about this. It's actually going to
Exactly.
make a change because
Right.
that's the true god of the capitalist society. It's the shareholders. So
One thing I want to shift to is you've dedicated a lot of your recent kind of posts to how Israel is losing its ground campaign. And that was really interesting for me to hear because the US has essentially invested billions and billions of dollars into Israeli military, trying to ensure that Israel, as a state, an illegal state, will still exist. So, what specifically made you reach the conclusion that Israel is losing the ground campaign? I'm curious.
well, the most basic thing is in order for Israel to be successful, they have to defeat Hamas. If Hamas
Right.
wants to be successful, they just have to not lose. That's it. They just have to not lose. And
Yeah.
not only are they not losing, two of their best line infantry brigades, the Golani Brigade and the Gavati Brigade, have been taken out of action, put back into the rear to reconsolidate because they've taken so many casualties that they're now combat ineffective.
Right.
That is insane. You can just see it in because the IDF publishes footage of them in action, and so does
Right.
Hamas. And I'm in all the Telegram channels. I have friends who also process information because it's just like too much to get around to. But like, I'm
Right.
not the only one behind this operation that I'm running right now.
Right.
So yeah, it's just Hamas are clearly trained and competent, and while the IDF has fancy toys like Merkava tanks, they're a bunch of conscripts with no training who don't even do the most basic competent infantry stuff. It's like
Right.
you have no chance. Also, they have created the worst tactical environment for themselves. They've created Stalingrad. I don't know if you're familiar with that battle from World War II.
I am. Yes.
Yeah, that's the worst place. That's for an occupying force to fight in Stalingrad is the worst thing
With
ever.
all the rubble and the rocks and everything on the ground, and really,
Yeah, because their biggest advantages are tanks. And guess what? Like tanks can go over hills and stuff, but they can't go over rubble because they'll start busting tracks. Like the tracks, of the tank will just start flying off. So they're having to bring
right.
in bulldozers. It takes forever to clear anything. And what happened in Stalingrad? Sniper operations.
Yeah.
That's why we're seeing like lieutenant, like three majors killed in a single day. That you only see that when you're just getting sniped to an insane
Right.
degree. So they're losing leadership. Their morale's obviously horrible because there's nothing more demoralizing than the sniper operations. Because like you just like lose a couple guys and there's no one to fight, and you're just like stuck with that. Like, it's
Right.
not great for morale. Also, we know they're lying about their casualty figures because that's what they always do. Also, they haven't achieved any of their tactical objectives. They haven't recovered any hostages, and they haven't verifiably killed or captured any Hamas leadership. I know for a fact that they've been able to kill some Hamas fighters, but they're saying that they've done thousands. Nah, no, not even
Right.
close.
I mean, you know, the situation looks really bleak for them when they have to resort to killing journalists and, people who are essentially the only way for the voice of the people in Gaza to be heard outside of the confines of the area itself. I mean, that's a really cowardly way to take forth ground operations.
Well, what they're doing is punitive killings, right? So they'll like take a which is a mass casualty. They'll lose some guys, and they won't have anyone to fight because Hamas does hit and run attacks because they have to, because they don't have air superiority. So they like engage for like 10, 20 seconds and then hightail it out of there. So they take a couple casualties. They're not able to engage Hamas anymore, and Hamas just disappears. And so what are we going to do? We're going to get revenge by killing a bunch of civilians. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a string of revenge killings.
For now, the US mainly, its actual physical impact in Israel has been the funding in the military and kind of providing them with all these fancy military supplies. Do you think it will ever get to a point where US troops will physically get in there and actually fight?
it would be absolute insanity if we did. It would be like getting sucked down into pariah statehood with Israel. I think there would be such a massive outcry within our own country. I don't, you know, I say it's so insane that they wouldn't do it, but I think the past 3 months have kind of put that idea to rest. So,
Right.
the only reason I would see them getting involved into a regional war with boots on the ground is if Hezbollah commits to a full offensive, because the IDF will not be successful in repelling Hezbollah. But then again, Hezbollah won't do it because what they're doing is escalation management. There's no reason to see why like Nasrallah would commit to an offensive because they haven't right now. It's all been very manageable. And again, Hamas cannot ever defeat the IDF. Like Hezbollah probably wouldn't be able to either because they just don't have air superiority or like tanks or anything like that. But all they have to do is not lose. Again, they just have to not lose.
I've seen you've done some videos where you've broken down very deeply a lot of the kind of Israeli manufactured myths surrounding just everything that's been going on. What would you say are some of the major ones you've debunked?
For me, I think that the most ridiculous one was the massive weapons cache they found inside Al-Shifa Hospital.
Right, just everything laid down on the ground.
Yeah, and it's like, first of all, my uncle, I mean, I live in Texas. My uncle has more guns than that in his gun cabinet. It's like, okay, great. I've seen bigger weapons caches in random tool sheds, in southern Afghanistan. And guess what? Guess what seasoned and experienced insurgents don't do? Displace to another location and leave their weapons behind. It doesn't happen because it's stupid. And by the way, they only had like 4 AK-47s. Those were like drop guns. Drop guns are guns that like dirty cops have when they accidentally shoot somebody, and so they go back into their car, take out a random gun, and be like, "See, he had the gun. We had to shoot him." So it just looks like drop guns because that's what it is. It's drop guns.
So kind of to wrap this conversation up. So if you had personally one shot at solving the conflict once and for all, or I wouldn't call it conflict because obviously the playing field has never been leveled, but the whole Israeli-Palestine issue, if you had one shot at fixing it, what would be the first thing you would do?
Regime change. Like Netanyahu and his cohort have to go. There will be no peace. There will be no reasonable diplomatic solution as long as they're in power.
Right. And who would replace them?
Hopefully a more like centrist party. I think we're a ways off from that. I think Bibi is going to draw this thing out as long as possible because as long as the fighting is going on, he's not getting prosecuted for trying to dismantle the Supreme Court.
Right.
So
I would say though that I think that's definitely a good first start, but I would say it's not enough to really achieve the changes that at least Palestinians are looking for.
Oh, no. That's just step one. Like nothing can happen until this government gets out there. But this is a much longer conversation, but at least from a military and strategic perspective, a two-state solution is never going to fly.
I know you personally, one of the things that you've been doing is really being a voice for just furthering the truth and what you have used as your own expertise to debunk a lot of the stuff that, Americans have been consuming from mainstream just by default. What do you think is, for the average population, the best way or the most effective way to kind of raise awareness about this? What do you think the responsibility people have in terms of really supporting Palestinians?
Supporting Palestinians is like not letting the conversation die. That's like the main thing because this is not going to end anytime soon. A ceasefire will eventually be called, and then they're going to try to move in settlers, paramilitary settlers, into Gaza. So this conversation can't die. And then after the ceasefire has been solidified, and then they withdraw from Gaza, guess what? The entire freaking city is destroyed. So now, not only do we send $14 billion in weapons, we're going to have to send billions more dollars to start rebuilding it because, so it's going to take freaking years. And
it is, but hopefully this time around really encourage people to think more about all of this because this is a cycle we've been seeing for the past over 7 decades. So I think that's really a lot of the fear that people have is that this is going to be a ceasefire again and everything will go back to the quiet mode, and still the Palestinians are experiencing everything that they've been going through for the past 75 plus years.
Yeah, so the biggest thing is no quiet mode. Like even after the ceasefire, if like reparations aren't being paid and like aid still being blocked, guess what? Traffic to JFK Airport needs to keep getting blocked.
Right.
Sorry. Like ceasefire is still a very conservative position to have. It's not even
Right.
yeah. So, yeah, that's fine.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time for you, but I really benefited from this conversation, and I hope you are also successful in everything that you are currently doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.